So let's talk through how to play Warhammer 40k 10th edition one chunk at a time. First up, let's talk model soldiers, dice and rules, and what you'll need to play a game of Warhammer in the first place. Hello and welcome to Auspex Tactics, where this will be the first in the series of how to play Warhammer 40k 10th, Games Workshop's new and reimagined version of Warhammer 40k, which I think is going to be drawing a whole load of people to the hobby. A new fresh way to be putting your miniatures on the table, punchy rules that are easier to access than ever before. As I'm sure most of you watching this will be well aware, Warhammer 40k is where you collect and paint little armies from the distant future and have them duke it out over a tabletop, hopefully the dice gods smiling in your favour, to deliver victory to your Space Marines or Tyrannies or any of the other myriad factions of the game. With 40k being regenerated in a bit of a hard reset since 9th edition, I thought it would be high time to start a new series to talk through how you play the game in the first place, and that's what this series will aim to be. Going from a standing start and assuming a very basic knowledge, I figured a what you'll need to play video is probably a good place to start, and then move forward into the core mechanics of the game, how you move, shoot and fight, and then going through slightly more in-depth things like constructing armies and playing missions. There'll be plenty more like this on the way, so feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more. So what exactly do you need to find yourself if you want to play a game of Warhammer 40k then? Broadly speaking, I split it down into these categories: your models, the actual miniatures that you're going to be putting on the table. You're going to need some troops and war machines to command. You need the rules for playing the game and for playing your own individual army, so the core rules that govern the way that the models interact on the table, supplemental rules for the mission that you're playing, whether you happen to be playing with some of the cards or a more narrative game, and then the individual rules for the miniatures that you actually own, things like the stats for their guns and their points costs and things. For actually putting things on the tabletop, you'll need a few practical things like a tape measure to measure ranges, dice that determine how well your models fight, and a few other practical things can help as well. And then you'll actually need somewhere to play your miniatures, a tabletop and some terrain to have your models fight out over a battlefield. Starting out, and perhaps the single most exciting bit, are the actual miniatures themselves. To play Warhammer 40k you're going to need an army, and collecting it, painting it up and putting it on the table is basically the core hobby experience. How many miniatures you'll need depends on the size of game that you're playing. If you're just playing a combat patrol game, literally all you'll need is one of the combat patrol boxes that Games Workshop sells. A lot of people like to play at either 1000 or 2000 points though, that's more of the core game of Warhammer 40k and 10th. Depending on your army, that might be somewhere in the region of around 10 to 20 units perhaps, depending on how big or elite things that you put in the army. 40k has a whole ton of different factions, everything from arcane space elf Eldar, to the hard-bitten tank-heavy forces of the Imperial Guard, murderous and otherworldly chaos demons, or the golden guardians of the Emperor himself, the Adeptus Custodes. Generally in 10th edition you play with just one of these factions. Allies aren't quite as major a thing in this edition compared with some of the previous ones, though of course in more casual games between friends just about any rule can be bent or broken if you want it to. The Warhammer miniatures from Games Workshop come as these flat pack plastic sprues like this. You snip them out from their frames with some plastic cutters, glue them together with either plastic or super glue, and plenty of the kits have flexible options to give your soldiers different guns or different aesthetics. There are certainly options when buying Warhammer 40k miniatures. Lots of people do buy direct from Games Workshop, generally the most reliable and often fastest, but can often be the most expensive as well. Otherwise lots of other options exist, buying through local gaming stores such as say Element Games or Noble Knight linked in the video description. They'll typically stock things at a small discount from Games Workshop prices, and there's lots of stores with similar offerings. The second-hand market can often be worth a look with eBay or other places. Quality can of course vary if they're second-hand, but can save lots of time and effort potentially. And there's also the ever-growing market of 3D printing. This can potentially be used to supplement Games Workshop armies with other cool bits or designs, and can be another tool to look into for savings. In general though, once you get your hands on the miniatures, you put them together the way that you'd like, undercoat them with a spray can, and then you can basically paint them up in the colours of your choosing, either creating your own custom force or copying one of the colours from lore. You certainly can play 40k with unpainted miniatures, though it's generally considered to be a slightly nicer gaming experience if you do have paint on them. Definitely adds to the spectacle and immersion. As mentioned, you can play Warhammer games of just about any size. 10th edition is recommended either for small combat patrol games or then anywhere between 1000 and 3000 points. I'll aim to go into army constructions and mission videos later in this series. When you've got some nice shiny miniatures to put on the table, you'll need some rules, and as mentioned I break this down into three main sections: the 40k core rules, your faction rules, and the rules for any mission that you're playing. The core rules for Warhammer 40k have been consolidated and polished a bit compared with 9th edition. It's now 60-ish pages of primary gameplay that governs all armies, a large part dedicated to the actual turn-by-turn gameplay of 40k, the way the armies move, shoot, charge and fight, but it also has things like command points and universal stratagems, details on datasheets, terrain features, and how to build your army. There'll be two main options for getting your hands on these, either a free download from Warhammer Community, probably the easiest to be honest, and means that you don't have to carry around an enormous great big rulebook unless you want to. Otherwise it will be the big rulebook like the Leviathan book that comes in the 10th edition launch box initially, swiftly followed up by the 10th edition core book as a slightly smaller individual sales offering. Those books do have the core rules in them, but it might mean that you're carrying around a whole bunch of extraneous stuff, as well over 100 pages of miniature galleries and lore and things too. Then, as well as the core rules for playing the game, you'll also need the rules for your miniatures that you own, these ones being the individual stats of your troopers, things like how hard they are to kill, how much damage they do with their guns, and their leadership and weapon options and things. 10th edition 40k will start out with some basic rules for each faction. Games Workshop has an offering of indexed data cards. These will have one card for each unit's rules, plus a launch detachment with basic rules of play for the army, things like the faction special rule like the Space Marines Oath of Moment, plus a launch detachment or way to play the army, with things like stratagems to amp up your forces or enhancements to put on your leaders. There'll be two primary ways to get your hands on these, either available to buy for each faction, at least they'll cost a fair bit less than a big expensive hardback codex, or again you'll be able to digitally download them from Warhammer Community. The rules for every 40k army will be free at time of launch at least. To put the rules together into an actual army, you'll also need points costs for these as well. In general in 40k, each unit and upgrade costs points depending on how powerful they are, and that's the main balancing system of the game to make armies fairly equal against each other. The points cost won't be printed on the data cards as Games Workshop likes to update them to try and make game balance better from time to time, so they should be on a digital download from Warhammer Community at launch and also accessible via their promised army builder. In reality, for points costs and things, third-party army builder apps and things will help people quite a lot with putting army lists together. Things like Battlescribe and Warhapedia are used by many. They can be another source for finding out the points and rules for armies. They can lag behind Games Workshop a bit while the fans who run them update them. Then after 10th edition's launch, Games Workshop will follow up these index cards with codexes for each army. These are Games Workshop's hardcover army books, and they come out slowly over the course of the edition, each one adding updated rules and new options for each faction. It sounds like besides updated core rules for the armies, they'll also be adding more detachments as one of their main selling points. That allows you to build different themes within your army. Say for example, the Space Marines one will add a first company strike force, it's believed. Say if you wanted to theme your army around Terminators and Veterans as opposed to a bit more of a balanced force, the codexes will also add Crusade and Combat Patrol rule sections, additional content if you're playing with either of those game modes. In general, if you're playing an army that has had its codex come out, you probably want to pick that up as well. Finally, for rules needed to play a game of Warhammer 40k, you'll need to know the rules for the actual mission that you're playing. The rules for engagement over the tabletop, usually some combination of killing your opponent's miniatures with your army, combined with taking objectives or doing certain actions throughout a game to earn you victory points. Games Workshop will support a whole ton of different ways to play Warhammer 40k, and you can always just dispense with their recommendations and make your own if you're playing casually. Just for some examples though, there'll be a super simple Only War mission from the core rulebook. That will be quite a good starter one. The chapter approved mission deck, these cards that you can see here, that's now going to be considered the standard way to play Warhammer 40k 10th it would seem. This one randomizes your objectives, your deployment map, and has a system of secondary objectives that each player can tailor to their own army. These mission cards will be first available in the Leviathan box, but will also be sold separately as well. Otherwise, there's those other two game modes, Combat Patrol for single box versus box games of 40k. There'll be a section for those rules in the big rulebook or again in a free download, and you need some faction specific rules downloads for that mode as well, as the rules vary a bit compared with mainline 40k to try and balance the boxes against each other. Finally, there's also the narrative game mode of Crusade. This one's designed for linked games and building up an ongoing narrative for your force. Pretty nice for maybe a slightly more casual gaming group when narrative is at the forefront. Those rules will be in the big rulebook, and also I believe first available to buy in a Tyrannic War supplement book. Then moving on, when you've got your miniatures and the rules to play them with sorted, you do need a few more practical things for gaming. I break those down into a few things that are absolutely essential, and then a whole bunch of items that can be handy, but you maybe don't 100% need for definite. Core to Warhammer 40k is the 6-sided dice. They're the only dice type in Warhammer 40k, and you'll generally be throwing a lot of those around to determine whether your models can hit or wound the enemy, or whether you pass your saves to avoid their damage. Generally you'd want a fairly hefty amount of these, I'd say. I'd go for over 20 at a minimum, though it can be handy to have plenty more. You can get them very cheaply or just online off eBay or something. Games Workshop does sell some fairly expensive but fairly snazzy ones that are themed around the different 40k factions. You'll usually need a set of objective markers if you're going to be playing most of the standard missions. I know these ones look all very fancy, and these are ones that Games Workshop have sold in the past. They can be super simple bases or coins though, usually 40mm across, and a fair few non-Games Workshop companies do make their own objective markers, basically mass mat style neoprene ones, with the actual distances marked on them for how close your models need to be to score on the objective. Usually you'll need 6 or less of these. Finally, for absolute essentials, you'll need a tape measure. Warhammer 40k uses inches as its primary measurement. Most normal tape measures will do fine for this. Doesn't need to be anything fancy at all. Otherwise, there's a whole bunch of hobby accessories that are pretty nice to have. Can usually be pretty handy to have a few dice with more numbers on them, perhaps a few d20s or something like that. These are used for tracking wounds on high toughness models, say like tanks and vehicles, and how many lives they have left. A dice tray can be pretty handy to keep dice rolls together. Can be pretty handy just to have a flat surface to roll them on as well. Pen and paper are pretty handy for keeping scores if you're using any of the missions that have some slightly more complicated objectives on. Plenty of people use some basic measuring tools like a 9-inch range ruler, which can be a bit easier than extending and contracting a tape measure all the time. That can be quite nice if you've got lots of models that come in from reserves. And plenty of armies quite like to use counters to mark ongoing effects in game. Often these are quite faction specific though. Lots of people like to make their own. Say for example if you use a stratagem to give a unit a 4+ invulnerable save, or -1 to hit or something, it's just quite handy to have the visual reminder there. There's loads more optional stuff to make quality of life a bit easier. Let me know down in the comments if there's anything else that you consider indispensable. Finally, you actually need somewhere for your armies to duke it out on, basically a flat surface, either a gaming table or maybe the floor, and then some terrain to set out on it. The board sizes from 10th edition have been tweaked just a tiny bit from 9th. It's now 44 inches by 30 inches for a standard combat patrol game, 44 by 60 for 1000 to 2000 points, perhaps generally considered the most common points values to play 40k at, and then 44 by 90 for 3000 point games, that getting on for really quite a big engagement there. You can just mark an area out on your tabletop for that. Some companies sell gaming mats, which can be quite nice to give a nice textured battlefield, and several Games Workshop terrain or boxes often come with little battle board things, some nice cardboard tiles that can be arranged together to make a bit more of an effective looking battle board than just a kitchen surface or carpet. Finally, you could play Warhammer 40k on Planet Bowling Ball with absolutely no terrain. In general though, this tends to be a bit of a bad idea, both visually and also giving your armies some interesting tactical things to fight round. There's lots of different places that you can acquire Warhammer 40k terrain. Games Workshop do make plenty of nice plastic kits themselves, though they are rather on the expensive side in my opinion. Besides them though, lots and lots of third-party companies have options if you just give it a Google search. There's anything from basic 3D printed terrain bits to MDF laser cut things that you can slot together. Depends what you want in terms of price and how it looks. There's plenty of different types of terrain that you can field. Perhaps one of the most common things is ruins like you can see in this picture. They also have plenty of rules for things like woods, barricades or other battlefield debris. In general though, as with 9th edition, are a few bits of terrain that block line of sight from your units to your opponent's units, and in general for each game I'd aim to have at least one or more of those within your own deployment zone, within the midfield, and within the opponent's deployment zone. Things that block line of sight, including ruins that get special rules to, are just very important as it stops one player just being gunned off the table by the other one getting first turn, and also helps to balance out ranged and melee armies, as range would have a big advantage if there's no terrain on the board. In general, I'd consider that one of the most important things to get right to start with. So anyway, I think we'll leave that there for this video. In general, what you need for 40k is your miniatures, the rules including the core rules, the ones for your army and the missions that you're playing, a few gaming aids like dice and a tape measure, and somewhere to play with terrain and a tabletop. Hope that's been of some help, and in the next one we'll get into the actual turn sequence of 40k proper, starting out with the command phase and battle shock. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more. I do tend to post new 40k things just about every day. I'm sure we're going to have lots to talk about for 10th edition. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's how I can afford to keep all these videos coming quite so regularly. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.